Welcome to Beekeeping Today podcast, your source for beekeeping news, information, and entertainment. I'm Jeff Ott.
And I'm Kim Flottam.
Hey, Kim. Well, you know, what's that old saying about you want to make God laugh is to tell him we have plans? That's about what it's about what happened with the plans to get all the interviews this last January, wasn't it?
Technology is wonderful when it works, and then when you push the wrong button at the wrong time, I'll tell you, I had more trouble than you can imagine there, and I came away from that meeting with nothing.
So you're telling me it's not the technology, it's the operator? Is that what you're saying?
This was operator error. There's no doubt about it. However, what I was able to get was make a lot of connections. So we're going to be doing this with a lot of people. We've got the president of the Apiary Inspectors of America coming on. We've got Eric from True Source Honey is going to be here.
Good.
And so, although I didn't get anything there, we were able to, and I'll say it carefully, make plans for down the road.
Oh, good. Well, that aside, I'm looking forward to today's interview. So let's just get right on into it. Well, this is going to be a fun podcast. This is one I've been looking forward to ever since we got our guests scheduled. Kim, you and Tom go back a long ways. Why don't you talk a little bit about that and introduce Tom?
Well, we do, Jeff. And by the way, it's good to talk to you again. Yes, I officially Dr. Tom Seeley, Cornell University, Ithaca, New York. Long ago and far away, he was at Yale University, and I was living in Connecticut. And the Connecticut beekeepers got into a squabble over pen cap M. And we had a trial, and we got Dr. Seeley to come down and testify. And we had his testimony, and we had the testimony of a commercial beekeeper, the only commercial beekeeper in Connecticut at the time. And he used the pregnant cow story, and Tom used the I'm a professor at Yale story, and we convinced the judge that we were right and pen should go away. And indeed, Connecticut was the first state to outlaw pen cap M being used in the state. So that goes back a long way. But thank you, Tom. It was a good day for beekeepers.
Yeah, and that was important because people didn't realize that when you microencapsulate a pesticide, you're basically making the pesticide into a pollen grain. And so that's become very, very dangerous.
Well, Tom is here today. We're going to talk about probably a lot of things, but I wanted Tom to come on and talk about his two most recent books, and both of them are fascinating. One of them is applying simple beekeeping techniques or a simple honeybee. I'm not sure. What are we applying, Tom, when you go out and do your bee lining? What's the word I want there?
Well, we're applying the bee's biology in terms of the bee's ability to recruit to rich food sources, and we're taking advantage of that communication ability to let the bees lead us back to their nests. And this is something that people have been doing for thousands of years. And now we know much more about exactly why it works. But it's something that we've long done, and it's still a lot of fun.
This, of course, is from Tom's book, Following the Wild Bees, The Craft and Science of Bee Hunting. And he is an expert at it, and he tells us how to do it. I've read it a couple of times already. I've done it in the past. I'm better at it now, having read Tom's book again. But why don't you just kind of tell us about bee lining, bee hunting? You call it. I always called it bee lining. Both the art and the science of it, as you presented in your book, is a fascinating story.
It's a good read.
Thank you. Well, first of all, the heart of it is to find a wild colony of honeybees. Though sometimes you work your way back to a beekeeper's hive, and that's fun too. And it's different from beekeeping because you are not managing bees. You're just offering them food. You're letting them lead you back to their home. So you're conducting a treasure hunt. You're not trying to, though these days you don't actually go to the wild colony, the bee tree, cut it down and pull out the honey. That's what was done for, as I say, thousands of years. That's how bee hunting got started. And it's done now just as a hobby or a pastime. Bee hunting's a lot like geocaching, only instead of getting your instructions about where you're searching for the goal from somebody on your smartphone, you get it from the bees who are coming to a little feeding station that you're operating. Yeah, so the way it works and is that you go to a patch of flowers, and it can be anywhere. It could be in your backyard. It could be way out in the countryside. It can even be in a park in a city. And I've hunted bees in Central Park, New York City. You go to a patch of flowers. You use a little device called a bee box, which is just a way of capturing some bees so you can introduce them to a small square of old comb that you've put sugar syrup into. And then you trap the bees in your little bee box with that comb filled with the sugar syrup. You leave them closed up for a few minutes. You let them out. And 9 times out of 10, some of the bees you've captured will have discovered your little wonderful feeding station, and will go home, and then will come back, and eventually they'll bring their hive mates, nest mates with them. And then that creates eventually a trail or a directional information that you can use to work your way back to their home, which is, who knows where it is at first.
So to do this, you need the preferred method is a little bee box, and I remember seeing one of those at Brushy Mountain used to sell them before they went under. But the little bee box and the old comb with sugar water, and for the sugar water, could you use honey, or is it just sugar water is just more easier to handle and work with?
Honey's a little too thick, Jeff. Mm-hmm. It takes the bees too long to suck up a load of honey. Okay. So we use a sugar solution that's about 2 parts sugar and 1 part or 1.5 parts sugar, 1 part water. Okay. And that makes a pretty thick syrup. You want it thick so it's highly sweet and attractive, but not so thick that it's hard for the bees to drink it up.
All right. And then I assume a compass and a pad of paper?
Yes, you'll need a notebook because you're going to be taking information about the direction that they're flying off, and you record that direction using your magnetic compass. The other thing that's very handy to have is some paint pens, like what we use to mark queens, so that you can label some of the bees when they come back to your free lunch, put a dot of paint on them. And the reason you want to do that is you want to be able to time bees. You want to see how long it takes individual bees to fly home and then come back to your feeder. And that is useful to know because that is an indicator of the distance. We can talk about how you translate those times into distances. I just wanted to stress that everybody that I've done it with has said they have had a great time. And why is that? Well, there's a couple of things. One, of course, you're working with the bees. You're getting to watch the bees very closely. When you're a beekeeper and you pop the lid on a hive, what have you got in front of you? You've got thousands of bees, and they're all anonymous. And our focus really we can't follow an individual very well. But when you're bee hunting, you're working with a handful of bees, maybe only 5 or 10 at a time. They're labeled as individuals, and you can really focus on what an individual bee does, how it behaves when it comes in, lands, loads up with food, cleans itself off, and then flies home. You have a much more personal and intimate experience as a bee hunter than as a beekeeper. So that's part of the fun. Another part of the fun is that you're outdoors, and you're it's often something I like to do, just start in the afternoon and see how far I can get on a sunny day when the flowers are in bloom. So you're outdoors. A third thing is it takes you to places you wouldn't otherwise go because you're going to go back to wherever the bees live. And that often, as I say, it takes you to places of great beauty or ones you didn't know about because you're following the bees down their bee line step by step. So there's a lot of things that make it fun. And it can be done by yourself if you like to work alone or you need some quiet time, or it can be done in a small group I've done it with groups of up to 20 individuals, and that works really, really well because you have lots of eyes to track the bees and see which direction they're going home. So the old timers called it a sport. They called it bee lining, as Kim mentioned, and they would do it partly for the honey, but most often for the fun. If you read the old books, they often talk about the challenge of it and the thrill of finding the bee tree.
But I wish I had known about this when my daughter and son were young, because they always liked working with me in the bee yard, and then this would have been just another avenue of enjoyment for them at that age, or the 6-7 age. It's a great sport then.
Yeah, it is. It is really. It's a lot of young people, children, think bees are scary because they know they can sting. So what I've experienced is they take delight in realizing, oh, I can get up really close to a bee. I can get with my face, inches from a bee and look at how it sucks up the sugar syrup, how it grooms itself without any fear. And because, again, you're not opening a hive, the bees are not disturbed, they're not defensive. Instead, you're giving them a free lunch, and they're happy as clams at high tide. So it's a different relationship to the bees than in a beekeeping scenario.
Yeah, I like that.
No bee veil, no bee suit, no bee gloves.
Not hot and sticky.
Not hot and sticky.
Well, Tom, there's a good question. Then why did you write a book about this? Isn't there enough out there already? Or, I already know the answer to that, but go ahead.
Thank you for asking that question, Kim. It's a great question because, as you know, writing any book is a ton of work, even a little book like this one, if you want to do it well. The reason I wrote this book is because there are really only a handful of books that are written on this topic. There are many books in which where it is discussed, but there's only about 5 books total that were written by somebody who actually was a bee hunter. And all of those books that were written prior to mine talked about the craft, but not also about the science. In other words, I felt that I could make the sport even more interesting by explaining what we know about the biology and behavior of bees to understand why these bee hunting techniques work. And so that's why I call the title of the book Following the Wild Bees, the Craft and Science of Bee Hunting. So,
well, it's obvious when you read the book, and it certainly gives it more depth. And it's not only the how to, it's the why to. And I think that was the part that I enjoyed the most. Yeah. Why does this work?
I liked it. When I was reading it, I really enjoyed the tying in of the biology and the behavior that made it, or not make it work, but just why it worked. And I enjoyed that tie-in. So I really enjoyed the book. It's I recommend it to anybody.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's one more thing I'd like to mention, and that is, for me, it was a challenge to write about in a way that would be entertaining. There's lots and lots of, as you know from reading the book, I weave in, just anecdotes and stories and challenges and ups and downs of being a bee hunter, and that made it. It was a new kind of writing. I'm a scientist, so usually I'm writing something that's not quite as it's a different style. So that was part of the fun of writing, to develop a new way of telling stories.
That's great.
You mentioned the ups and downs, and from when I was doing it a few years ago, I remember tripping over logs you don't see because you're watching the sky and not where you're walking. And I imagine you've had some of those experiences.
Yeah, what was probably the most embarrassing one? The most embarrassing was when I think I blocked it out. I'll have to come back to that one. There was one of the ones that was most challenging was when the bees flew off from the field where I was starting my bee hunt, and they flew across a river that was a half a mile wide. Now that was a challenge.
That's a big
was
river.
able to. It was up in Maine. It's an estuary kind of river where the river widens out as it comes out to the mouth of the river at the sea. So I had to go all the way back up the estuary and around and pick up the line on the other side.
But add that to the equipment list, a canoe or.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, right. The perfect justification for getting that little boat you always wanted.
One of the things that you just mentioned were the tools that you could probably use, a canoe in this case, but there is a bucket of tools that you bring with you when you do this.
Yeah, yes, there is. The main tools are the bee box, and these are very simple tools. The little bee box, that's the most complicated one, but even that is not hard to make. And some of the bee supply places like Better Bee up in Upper New York State, they sell a nice bee box, and also Hudson Valley Bee Supply sells the Cadillac of bee boxes. That's a beauty they sell. Anyhow, so you need a bee box. You need a little. You can use it's nice to have an empty hive body to provide you with a little table to set up on. You need a piece of comb, square of comb, about 2 inches square. Nice, dark, old, sturdy comb is good. You need a jar, like a canning jar of the sugar syrup. It's not too thick and not too thin. You need a dropper bottle to take the sugar syrup out of your jar and put it in the comb. It's nice. You need some paint pens. You need a notebook. It's good to have a watch so you can do timing of the bees. So none of this is very technical equipment. Oh yeah, the most technical thing is that magnetic compass. You want to have a compass so you can write down the direction the bees are flying off. I like to also have a topographical map so that when I see the direction the bees are going, I can look ahead see what's across the countryside in that direction, and that helps me plan the hunt. So that it all fits into a knapsack or a little kit box that you might build too. It's a low cost sport.
Well, Tom, do you want to just run us through a quick session just to kind of give folks a feel for what you do first and what you do next, and then what you do next, and then there's a tree?
Yes, here are the stages of a typical bee hunt. You go to a field or an open area where you know there are flowers that the bees are visiting. And I like to do it any time of year from April into October. So let's say you go to a field in August or September that's filled with goldenrod. You look around, you find some bees on the goldenrod. Using your bee box, you capture some bees in the box. And then in ways that are a little hard to explain, but are explained well in the book, or if a person wants to see it, I can recommend a demonstration. There's a YouTube video that I made that's called Bee Hunting, Finding a Wild Colony of Honeybees. That's called Bee Hunting, Finding a Wild Colony of Honeybees. It runs for 24 minutes and it takes you all the way through a bee hunt. And it's been watched by over 200,000 people. So I guess it works. And so that's, if you really want to see a demonstration and you've got 24 minutes, you'll see me explain the whole thing from start to finish. But it starts by capturing bees in the box and then using the box's features. You can then insert the comb filled with the sugar syrup into the box that introduces the bees to the comb. After 5 minutes, you let the bees out of the box. They've loaded up, they'll fly home. And then you sit there and wait, because now you need to see if some of them will come back. If nobody comes back, it means the forage is too plentiful and the bees would prefer to go to flowers than your feeder. But if some do come back, now you start labeling the individuals and you can start taking notes and see, well, did that bee go to the east or did it go to the southwest? And you can start timing the bees. Was it 5 minutes away? If it's only 5 minutes away, it means it's less than only about a quarter of a mile away. If it's 10 minutes away, it's probably more like a mile away. And so you can decide, do I really want to go for a mile or am I lucky today? And I've only takes 5 minutes. Then I'll persist. And then once you've done that, you've got a sense of the direction and a rough sense of the distance. You actually put your little comb back in the bee box, wait for the bees to pile onto the comb, and they're usually eager beavers to get more sugar syrup. You close up the bee box, and then you pick up everything and you move off in that direction. Like I had to jump across a river once, in the direction that the bees were going towards their home. And then you get to your new place. Again, it has to be a clearing, so you have a clear view of which direction the bees are flying away. You let the bees out, and now you repeat the process. And now, of course, you'll be closer, so it won't take the bees as long. Everything will speed up. Every once in a while, though, what you find is the bees are no longer flying off in the direction they were before. They're flying back in the opposite direction. That means you jumped past their home. So now you work your way in reverse. You work your way back down the line that you moved along. And then when the bees are taking only a minute or two to make a round trip, 2 minutes, say, then you have to just start searching for the tree. You know you're within 100 yards of the tree, but you don't know where it is. And often the entrance can be inconspicuous. So that part can be quite a good search. It's in that now you're really, sometimes it's very easy if the entrance is low down and conspicuous, but oftentimes these entrances are high up and they're not so conspicuous. But that's where the craft, the skill, the persistence of the bee hunter comes in at that final stage of the hunt.
I could see that would be, where that would be great sport, especially for people who like solving puzzles and riddles and getting to that last 100 yards to find that location would be a challenge. I just want to mention that we will put a link to that YouTube video on in the show notes with the podcast, so people can find your YouTube video on bee hunting and finding the wild colony of honeybees. That'd be fun.
Thank you. That really is the best way for me to communicate how the process works is through that demonstration on the video.
Well, Tom, as exciting as that has been, and chasing bees through the woods can be exciting sometimes. I've tripped enough to recall most of that. But what else we wanted to bring up today was your new book, the one not out yet, or it's coming out in April this spring. And it's Honeybees in the Wild, the lives of bees, the untold story of the honeybees in the wild. And I was one of the fortunate people that got to read it early, and I sat there, I couldn't put it down. And for as many books as I read, not to be able to put one down is, to me, it was fascinating. I think it's about kind of a trail on from your first book on hunting wild bees, because the question is asked is, are there still bees living in trees? Are there still wild bees? Have they all been wiped out by Varroa? And you seem to answer a lot of the questions that are there, and I'm just going to get out of your way here. And are there still bees in trees?
Yes, there still are bees in trees. They have not been wiped out by Varroa destructor and the viruses that it spreads, even though the bees in the trees, every colony I found living in the wild in a tree does have the Varroa. And that might seem paradoxical, but what has happened here is that these bees, and I'm referring here in particular to the bees living in the Arnott Forest, the research forest owned by Cornell University, which is about, it's many square miles. But these bees have experienced strong natural selection for mechanisms of resistance against the mites. And we're still learning about what these mechanisms are, but they include things like killing the adult phoretic Varroa by biting off their legs, disrupting the reproduction of the Varroa by opening the cells in which the Varroa are reproducing. And also, the bees may have developed a shorter development time, so it makes it the period in which cells are capped is a little shorter. We know the bees in the wild are a little smaller than the bees that we have in our hives at the laboratory. So that may reflect their shorter development time. But what we do know is that the bees are not using smaller cells. Their cells are just a tad smaller than the cells that our bees make on foundation. So the bees do still live in the wild, and part of that is because they've undergone strong natural selection for these mechanisms of resistance. There are also, however, many things about the way these wild colonies live their lives that help them deal with the varroa. And I'd be happy to talk about those too.
Well, of course, that's the $64 question: is what do they have that the bees in my hives at home don't have, and are and will succumb to varroa if I don't interfere somehow with that. But it's got to be me, not the bees. So, what have you got there that they're doing that we probably should be looking at real hard?
Yeah. In general, two things. One is to get stock or bees that have been selected for resistance. I do that by capturing wild swarms from remote places. Those bees come along, and I can just stick them in a hive, and they will persist without any treatments. But I don't just stick them in any hive, because this gets to another part of what's going on in the wild. The way they live is different, and in particular, they live in small colonies. Their nest cavities are about the size of one deep 10-frame Langstroth hive body. So it's a relatively small nest, so they don't have as much brood for the varroa to reproduce on. And that also means that the period in which they have brood ends sooner. You come by the middle of August, those colonies are filling up their nest with honey, and they have just the amount of brood is just available for the mites is not very large. The other thing that happens in the summer in the wild, in a wild colony, is they swarm every summer. So they have a broodless period where there's no capped brood for the mites to reproduce in. And that is also a time when the varroa mites are susceptible to all these defensive killing behaviors that the bees possess. And the third thing that they have going for them, which has to do with their lifestyle, not their genetics, is their colonies live widely spaced. They're on average about 1,000 meters apart. And what that means is if there's much less robbing going on between colonies in the wild, we now have evidence of that. And that means that if you have a colony that crashes with varroa, because not every colony does survive, but in the wild, if a colony crashes with varroa, the neighboring colonies are not nearly as likely to go over and rob from it and pick up the mites and get heavily infested with mites through robbing. So there's a lot about the genetics and the ecology of these wild bees that is enabling them to survive. Here's an example. I mean, I've been following these wild colonies now since the 1970s, and I've done 2 studies where I've looked at really carefully at how their survival and reproduction works. And I'll just walk you through an example, because it's a little different than in a beekeeping situation. We would like 100% of our colonies to survive every winter. In the wild, here's how it works. Let's say you're in May and you have 100 colonies living out in the woods. Almost none of those colonies in those trees will die over summer, and most of them will produce, on average, they'll produce 1 swarm. So you start with 100 colonies in a forest in May. In September, you've got 200 colonies, 100 of the original colonies and 100 colonies started by new swarms. Now what happens? Well, those colonies that are what I call established colonies, they've been there for more than a year, 80% of them will get through the winter and 20% will die. So there's still mortality. The new colonies, what I call the founder colonies, well, they have a much tougher time. Only 20% of them survive and 80% of them die. That's because it's just hard to get a new colony going. But what that means is next May, there's 100 colonies again in that forest. There's 80 of the old colonies that made it through the winter, and there's 20 of the new colonies that made it through the winter. So we beekeepers, we're not, we don't like colony mortality, but out in the wild, it's half the colonies of the 200 that made it, that are there living in the woods in September, 100 of them are going to die over the winter. And part of that's because a lot of that is we're looking at natural selection in action too, both at the behavioral level and at sort of the evolutionary level. That's what's going on that's enabling colonies to live in the wild.
Well, I can see that there's a lot of that we could do, and I can see, I'll use your word, resistance from the beekeeping community in adapting some of those. It would be difficult to make money with bees having one every square mile and losing half of them every year, and them making not enough honey to harvest. But
yeah, that begs the question. Well, okay, what can we learn from these wild colonies? Certainly, we're not learning from them how to have a different model for commercial beekeeping. I think the way the bees are living in the wild is not a model for how to be a commercial beekeeper. For the reasons you just said, they're going through lots of mortality, they're small colonies, they're swarming and so forth. They're not making much honey. But I think that what we're learning about these wild colonies does provide a model for hobbyists or people that just want to have a few colonies in their backyard where they know that the colonies will get by and they don't need to make much or any honey from them, but they really enjoy having them there and watching them and studying them. So that's a different relationship between humans and honeybees, and that's one that I think that we don't see heralded very much in the world of bees and beekeeping. It's if you go into the bee magazines, and one very, very well, the ads in there are largely about honey production and getting your colonies big and productive so you can make lots of honey. And that, as you and I know, that was a model that worked perfectly well before Varroa and the viruses that it spreads. But now, to my mind, our bees are pretty sick, and I think they're sick almost all the time. But we're still pushing them. And if a human being were as sick as most of the bee colonies are, I don't think we would be asking them to be out and being as productive as they would be if they were healthy. And I think that's something that and you may think I'm nuts, but I think that's an adjustment that we're sort of slowly coming around to, and in fact will help us and help us to continue to enjoy the bees, have a different expectation for the bees.
It's definitely a mental shift in terms of going through your article in the January Bee Culture magazine and then Darwinian Beekeeping, which you pretty much outline this whole new way of thinking about keeping bees. Is it's against the tradition of the straight line of beehives along a tree line and all the white boxes 6 inches apart down the line. And so it doesn't fit that model anymore. So I'm curious to see what kind of reception you're receiving to this way of this new way of beekeeping.
Yes, you might expect it's a mixed reception, but that's why I want to stress. That's why I want to stress. I'm not saying it's appropriate for everybody. Right. I think it's probably only appropriate for us a certain segment of the beekeeping world, but it's beekeeper world. But it's a segment that I think we could respect more and give more credence to. People that want to do it on a small scale, want a colony of bees that's something they enjoy as a piece of nature, not as a production unit. And I think that's valid. And I think if you went back into the old scale beekeeping, when in England or Ireland or Scotland, they'd have a hive or two of bees in the backyard out behind the croft, and that it's more like that scale. And that's just an alternative. In America, we got the Langstroth hive. We had big fields. We could make honey. Tanker truckloads of honey, and that we had a different model. I think in writing this book, I wanted to remind us how bees live in nature originally, and I think that helps us in the following way. I think that helps us understand what we as beekeepers are doing to the bees and what we're undoing to the bees. We often don't know, and here I'm borrowing a phrase from a gentleman named Wendell Berry, where he wrote, and he's referring to agriculture in general, we cannot know what we are doing until we know what nature would be doing if we were doing nothing. And that's exactly what this book is about. How do the bees live when we are doing nothing to them? And so that tells us what we're undoing. And what are we doing? Well, we're dealing with bees that are not genetically adapted to their location. We're putting bees close together. We put them in large nest cavities. We put them in enclosures that are not well insulated. We put them in entrances that are near the ground instead of typically high up in the air. We don't let them have much drone comb. We put them in boxes where they're not inclined to coat the walls with propolis. Sometimes we're having them live in places where the diversity of the pollen is pretty low. We sometimes try to force them to rear brood out of season, even before there's pollen available in the wild, in nature. And we frequently disturb the colony. So there's a lot that we're undoing. And it's not always, most of those things are good for us, but not so good for the bees, as we're learning.
That's a long list of sins you just named. And you're exactly right.
Though I'd have to say, Kim, I don't think of them as sins, because it's a thing we're doing. Whether it's right or wrong depends on your aims and your needs. If you're a commercial beekeeper, you need to do those things. But you have to understand it's making life pretty hard for the bees. I guess what I would like to do is I would like to show beekeepers that there is an alternative model. And sometimes it's called natural beekeeping, or it has various names. I've forgotten them all now, but that is a model. And I guess I would like to show very clearly that there is a logic. There's a validity to that. It's not just a kooky way to be a beekeeper. It's in fact a thoughtful way to be a beekeeper.
There's a lot of people that would agree with that too. Excuse me, Jeff, go ahead.
No, I was just going to clarify it, because I'm pretty sure you're not advocating people just leave hives out in the backyard and let them natural selection take over and run amok, right? There is some management that you would have to do so that they don't become problem for the neighborhood and problem for area beekeepers.
I'm really glad you raised that point, Jeff, because yes, if you are in a place with other beekeepers around, then you have a different responsibility than if you're like me and I can stick colonies out way away from any other beekeepers, and then I can just let them sit and operate like a wild colony. But if you've got a neighbor who's got a colony 100 yards away, you're in a different situation. You really should monitor the mite levels, because we now know from a number of studies that if the mite levels get high and the colony crashes, those neighboring colonies, and they can be several hundred yards away or even farther, will find that colony come and rob it out and get loaded up with mites. And so yes, to do this Darwinian beekeeping, as I mentioned, you've got to monitor those mite levels. And if you find a colony that's where the levels are very high, I'm advocating treating that colony to knock the mite levels down, but also requeening it, or just killing it outright and starting over with some better stock. But yes, it would be irresponsible to just let it go and collapse and become a source of damage for other colonies nearby.
There are some of the things, though, that you bring up that almost any beekeeper, but certainly backyard beekeepers, could adapt to their hives. You mentioned the propolis envelope, and that is suddenly getting a lot of attention. And if you could figure out the kind of rough surface you need to make the inside of your hive, you would have a propolis envelope, and that's going to go some way in helping the hive take care of itself. You mentioned, excuse me, requeening, and I don't know how we could do that, because that's where we lose control, is when our virgin queen from our colony flies out. Where she goes and who she mates with is anybody's guess, and there suddenly you lose that genetic line. But we could do the propolis. We could do and another thing that you mentioned is the cavity itself. even if I make my cavity a little bit bigger or even a lot bigger, if I insulated it more, it sounds like it would be better, winter and summer. That makes sense?
Yes, let's talk a little bit about that. Focus on that insulation. That's one of the areas that is getting a lot of attention now, particularly by a gentleman named Derek Mitchell in England, he's basically a physicist beekeeper. And what he finds is, based on what we've found about the natural nests, that the level of insulation makes a huge difference on the physiology of the colony living inside there. For example, in the winter, if a colony, and if the bees are living in a thick-walled cavity and the entrance is at the bottom, which in nature is what the bees select. If you give them a choice between two boxes that are identical, one with the entrance at the top and one at the bottom, it's night and day. They'll go for the box with the entrance at the bottom, not at the top. So what Mitchell is finding, that when bees live in a well-insulated cavity and there's no top entrance, because of the insulation, the heat production of a typical winter cluster is enough to produce a heat pocket, a warm pocket in the top of a tree cavity. And again, that depends on there not being a top entrance so that the heat actually can accumulate, sit up there in the top. And what does having that hot pocket mean? It means that they're not in tight clusters, even during very, very deep cold. They're not the ambient, what's the relevant ambient temperature for the bees is not what's outside the cavity, it's what's inside the cavity where the cluster is. So he finds that they're not very tightly clustered in these well-insulated cavities without it, where the top is sealed. He also finds that there is condensation, but it's not where the bees are. The surfaces near the cluster are above the dew point, the point at which moisture condenses. Instead, the condensation's below the cluster, and that actually helps the bees, evidently, because it means in the winter, they can get water right inside their nest on a warm day. They can crawl down to the bottom, get water. And we're just now learning just how much water bees need in the winter. I don't know why we never recognized that earlier, but the bees are in that cavity. They're subsisting on this honey, which is, an 82% sugar solution, and they need water. You can't live on eating honey. You have to have some water to keep your osmotic balance going. So he finds that they can get the water right inside their nest. And so there's a lot that we're learning about the wild nest in terms of its insulation, the entrance position, the water dynamics in the nest, which we didn't know about. And, it really goes back to Langstroth invented a wonderful hive. It's a marvelous hive for human purposes, but nobody was looking about how bees were living in the wild, in nature back then. And so we leapfrogged past the biology, and I'd say we jumped past some important information. But the beauty of beekeeping is it's all under our control. We can make adjustments. We can improve we can do things differently as we learn more. And you mentioned one is the propolis wall. That's really important. And there's work out of the University of Georgia. I just read last night a nice paper where they looked at various techniques for inducing the bees to apply the propolis. And so, those are things we're learning. I'm optimistic.
You mean the propolis isn't there just to have to get in our way? We have to scrape off and wipe off our fingertips and clothing, and
I know.
There's a purpose for it.
Propolis is a real pain for the beekeeper, isn't it? I don't like you come home and your fingers are all gooped up for the whole week under the fingernails. But that's our perspective. From the bees' purpose, they've worked hard to collect it, and it's very valuable. The work by Marla Spivak at the University of Minnesota, she and her colleagues, they've shown that when those bees apply that propolis to the wall of their nest cavity, they're making a very far-reaching investment of the health of the nurse bees in their colony. Because the colonies that have that, their health is so much better. When they get to the point where they start producing food for the brood, they're in much better condition. So it's fundamental in ways that we didn't realize 5 years ago. The propolis is fundamental to the colony's health.
This is, I know I could sit here and talk with you all for the rest of the day. I know you have things you need to do, and I know Kim needs to do too. So would you be willing to come back to the podcast in the future, maybe after the April-May release of the book, and talk a little bit more about this concept of the Darwinian beekeeping and the things that you're learning? I think it's a fascinating topic, and I think our listeners would enjoy as well.
Yes, I'd be happy to, Jeff. And in fact, I'd be honored to. This is information that I think, as we talked about before, this is information for which that is important to a certain kind of beekeeping. And I feel that I would like to do my best to help to make this information available broadly. And your podcast, one way.
I think the other thing, Tom, is not only is information important, things we could be doing better, but it's certainly a list of things that if something's going wrong, we should be looking at your list to say, okay, what am I doing here that the bees don't like or wouldn't do on their own? So it's a primer for that also, I think.
Yeah.
A good one. The book is The Lives of Bees, The Untold Story of Honeybees in the Wild by Dr. Tom Seeley from Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. Tom, it's been great having you here today. And as you said, I hope we can get you back here again and talk some more about this. It's fascinating.
Thank you very much, Kim and Jeff, for having me. It's been really my pleasure.
It's been ours, definitely. Thanks a lot, Tom. We'll catch you next time.
Okay, very good. Bye-bye.
Bye. Well, that was certainly entertaining listening to Tom the other day. Have you gotten a chance to get out and look at that YouTube video?
I haven't. Rather than look at the YouTube video of what Tom did, I went out and looked at my bees, when the weather was good this weekend, and what I found was not good. It's been a tough winter on my bees. And my first thought as I'm looking through the colonies was, well, it's going to be package time this year, but not anymore. Now I'm going to get Tom's book and I'm going to go out and find a wild hive.
That's a really good idea. I watched the video and I thought, that's going to be my next sport. When I'm tired of doing anything dangerous or anything else I do, I'm just going to go out and sit on a chair and track honeybees. And it seemed like a really, really fun thing to do. Mm-hmm. Well, you've had time to think about our discussion with Tom. What do you think?
Well, I tell you, Jeff, how's that for two very different topics in one setting today? Something as ancient and practical as bee hunting and an up-close and personal encounter with how bees live in the wild. And in less than an eye blink, Jeff, I trust you see how very much alike these two books of Tom's are alike. One could, and for generations, lots of people did hunt wild honeybees for their wax and honey without having much understanding of why what they were doing really worked. I guess that's a testimony to those folks for making very good observations. Tom's simple explanation of the tools to use and how to use them goes a long way in making this sport easier and more fun. And it's a bigger story, but it's the bigger story, Jeff, that I think is so fascinating. Like I said, I've done this a few times in the past, so I was able to relate to the basics of it. But when you read his book, it brings so much more into the picture. It's more than catching bees, more than feeding them, releasing and watching and waiting for more to come back and do it all over again. But we don't hunt bees for honey anymore. If all, we chase them for the bees themselves, like I'm going to have to do this spring. And that's where his newest book comes into focus, How Bees Live Their Lives. The differences between what bees choose to do and what we use them for are striking, I think, don't you? They swarm every summer, live in much smaller cavities, live much further apart, raise far less brood in the summer, and quit raising it earlier. There's essentially no robbing, no mite transfer, an amazing propolis envelope that they live in, and winter losses of established colonies are acceptable, while losses of swarm colonies are exceedingly high. But here's the trick with that. The selection process on those swarm colonies is harsh as heck, but it works to their advantage. Those that survive are tough. Like Tom said, this isn't a model for commercial beekeeping. It's what bees do. And if you look at what we've done to bees, I think perhaps we should rethink some of the things we do. Now, this is a model for backyarders, I think, like he said, without neighbors if possible. And it's the way the bees choose if we don't get in the way. Jeff, I hope we can get Tom back on shortly to talk more about some of these issues. He's pointing in a direction that I think lots of people want to go.
I agree, Kim. Thanks a lot. It was really good to have Tom, and yeah, I think it'd be fun to have him back on the show, and maybe after his next book is published. So that'd be fun. Well, that about wraps up another episode of Beekeeping Today. I want to remind our listeners to rate us on iTunes. Give us 5 stars, leave us comments, leave us ratings. That would be fantastic. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to do that. You can reach us at questions@beekeepingtodaypodcast.com. We'd love to hear from you, and any ideas you have for shows or anything you'd like to discuss. And also, I just found this out. You can go, if you have an Apple phone or an Apple product, you can ask to listen to Beekeeping Today podcast through Siri. So you can say, "Hey Siri, let me listen to Beekeeping Today podcast." And
really, that works?
Yeah.
Oh, how cool is that? Okay.
Yeah, actually, I said it too loud, and now my phone's searching it right now. So that's enough, Siri. That's enough. All right.
Technology.
Yeah, it's always listening, even when you don't want it to. All right, Kim. Well, thanks. And we have some fun shows coming up, and that is not a plan. That is a given. They're already in the queue. So look forward to talking to you here again in a couple days.
Okay, take it easy, Jeff. Good talking to you again.
Thanks, Kim. You too. Bye-bye.